The table was set for 6. I'd spent the morning pressing the linen napkins and aligning the silverware with a precision that bordered on obsessive. A tall white candle stood in the center, surrounded by a ring of winterberry and pine. The roast ham rested under a silver cloche, still warm from the oven, and the cinnamon-spiced sweet potatoes filled the room with a scent I used to associate with family. I stepped back and looked at everything at the table, at the lights strung across the window, at the handwritten name cards I had pressed into tiny pine cones. I had even placed Nolan's beside the chair, with the widest view of the city skyline. I told myself it was symbolic, not submissive. The clock on the wall struck 5:30. I had asked them to come at 5. Maybe traffic. Maybe someone forgot the address. I checked my phone again. Nothing. The last message I sent to my mother had read, "Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Dinner's on me." No reply. I sat down for a moment and stared at my reflection in the darkened window, the city lights faint behind me. I looked presentable. A navy sweater, pressed slacks, clean-shaven. I had even bought the wine my father used to drink during the holidays, Cabernet from California with the gold foil on top. He'd once called it tasteful without being pretentious, back when we still shared things like opinions. At 6, I stood up and paced. I began to count the steps between the door and the oven. 8 steps. I'd done everything. The menu, the decorations, even a playlist of holiday music that skipped the cheesy stuff and leaned into jazz. Ella Fitzgerald was singing something about mistletoe, but it felt like mockery. I tapped Nolan's name on my phone and waited. 3 rings, voicemail. I hung up. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Then I called my mother. She picked up after 5 rings. Callan, she said, clipped and efficient. "Hi," I said, trying not to sound like I was straining. "I've got everything ready. I thought maybe you got stuck." There was a pause and then some clinking in the background. Plates, laughter, a sports game humming low. "Oh, right," she said, her voice dropping into that tone she always used when she didn't want to explain. "We're at Nolan's." It made more sense. He had space and, well, you know how it is. I didn't answer right away. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. "I hope you understand," she added. "We figured you'd be fine." I swallowed. "Yeah," I said. "Sure." She hung up before I could think of anything else to say. I stood in the middle of my apartment, still holding the phone. The candle on the table flickered, casting shadows over the empty chairs. Nolan's place card fluttered slightly as the heater kicked on. I sat down again, this time slower, like gravity had become heavier. I poured myself a glass of wine and lifted the cloche from the ham. Steam rose and quickly disappeared. I carved a slice and placed it on my plate beside a scoop of sweet potatoes. The first bite tasted like nothing. I chewed slowly, the fork heavy in my hand. Another bite. Another. My eyes stung, but I didn't let anything fall. I kept eating. I didn't want the food to go to waste. I looked across the table at the empty seats, and for a second I imagined them filled my father pouring wine, my mother offering compliments. She didn't mean Nolan cracking one of his effortless jokes. I almost smiled. Almost. And then the doorbell rang. I kept eating. The clink of my fork against the china filled the silence where voices should have been. I avoided looking directly at the empty chairs, but I still felt them like outlines of people who had chosen someone else over me again. The food, once warm and full of promise, had cooled. The sweet potatoes turned grainy. The ham had lost its richness. Still, I chewed. I used to believe if I just did everything right, they'd see me. I don't mean look at me. I mean see me, recognize me as something more than an obligation or an afterthought. But sitting there lifting one forkful after another to my mouth, I felt the same way I had so many years before, not forgotten exactly, just not chosen. When I was 8, I made my mother a bracelet out of pressed paper beads. I'd stayed up late stringing them on fishing wire, coloring each one carefully. Nolan had scribbled something on printer paper and handed it to her that same morning, a stick figure drawing with his name across the top. She smiled and tacked his onto the fridge. Mine stayed in the envelope. She said it was too delicate to wear. 2 years later, I brought home a report card with straight A's. Perfect attendance. A note from my teacher, Callan, is a model student. That same week, Nolan barely scraped by in math with a C-. I still remember Dad clapping him on the back at dinner and saying, "Proud of you for pushing through." When he looked at me, it was with a nod, like I'd met expectations, and that was all. And over time, they stopped even pretending it was balanced. "Nolan needs more support right now," they'd say, when he got caught lying about money or skipped classes or failed to show up for family dinners. "You should be grateful," my mother once told me after I asked why he never seemed to get grounded. "Not everyone's as easy as you." It wasn't said with cruelty. That's what made it worse. It was casual practice, the kind of comment you say 100 times before realizing it carries weight. Or maybe they did realize. Maybe that was the point. I looked down at my plate. A few green beans, a cold smear of gravy. I didn't want it anymore. I pushed it aside and poured another glass of wine. Outside, the city was quiet. A few cars passed below the occasional horn. Someone on the floor above me was playing a Christmas movie loud enough that I caught the edges of familiar music. I sat back in my chair and let the candle burn down the wax pooling into itself. I thought about texting Nolan again, not to accuse him, but to ask why. But I didn't. There were only so many times you could knock on a locked door without starting to wonder if the lock was there for a reason. Then came the second knock, not from memory, but from the hallway. The second knock wasn't loud. It was soft, hesitant, like someone unsure if they should even be there. I stood slowly, half expecting a neighbor to be returning a package or mistaking the door. But when I opened it, there he was. Grandpa Walter stood in the hallway, shoulders slightly hunched beneath his old wool coat. Snow clung to the cuffs. His hands were bare, red from the cold. He looked at me the same way he always had, without judgment, without agenda. Just seeing. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice raspier than I remembered, but still steady. "Grandpa," I breathed, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope slightly yellowed at the edges. He held it gently, like it might fall apart if he gripped too hard. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside, and he walked in with quiet footsteps, glancing once at the table set for 6, and then at the untouched food. He didn't comment. He never did when he could feel the ache before I spoke it. He sat across from me, placing the envelope on the table near the wine glass I hadn't refilled. Then he reached out and placed a hand on mine. His touch was warm, dry, grounding. "I waited until you were ready," he said, eyes still fixed on mine. For what I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. He nodded toward the envelope. To know the truth, I looked at it, plain, no name written across the front. The weight of it wasn't in the paper. It was in the moment. For as long as I could remember, Grandpa had always been the constant. While my parents measured their affection in rations, he gave it without terms. He taught me how to fix a carburetor, how to spot a lie in someone's tone, how to sit quietly without needing to fill the silence. But he'd also carried something behind his eyes, something unresolved. "Why now?" I asked. "Because tonight you finally stopped asking for something from them. And maybe now you're ready to take something for yourself." The envelope sat between us, harmless in appearance, but heavy with implication. I reached for it. My fingers trembled as they brushed the paper, and I felt the edge catch under my nail. Then I turned it over and opened it. The envelope gave a soft crackle as I opened the flap. Inside, 3 items slid gently into my palm. The first was a photograph faded, the edges curled. A young woman stared back at me with a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hair was the same ash-brown shade I saw in the mirror. Her eyes were unmistakable. Mine. I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, tracing the outline of her face with my thumb. There was something familiar in the way her mouth tilted slightly to the right, like she was trying to be brave. Beneath the photo was a folded letter. The handwriting was neat, slanted, feminine. I recognized the paper notepad stationery from a motel. The date at the top read April 12th, 1994. I wasn't even a year old. I didn't read it then. Not yet. My eyes had already fallen to the third item, a legal document aged and creased from being folded and refolded. It was a temporary guardianship agreement. Walter Royce named as guardian of a child, Callan Ellison. No mention of Dale or Meredith, no adoption. Just a signature and a notarization dated the same week as the letter. I looked up at Walter, still holding the photo in one hand, the paper in the other. You said they adopted me. He met my gaze without blinking. I said they raised you. I waited. He didn't rush. She was mine, he said quietly, glancing at the photo. Mara, my daughter. I stared at the woman again, Mara Ellison, my mother. We weren't close for long, he continued. She came back into my life when she was already pregnant. She was young, scared. The father wasn't in the picture. I promised her I'd help. His voice caught. He swallowed, then continued. She died shortly after you were born. Complications. It happened fast. I wasn't ready to raise a baby. My son Dale had been trying for a child with Meredith. I thought maybe I could give you stability, a home. I let the silence hang there. Walter didn't move. But they didn't want me, I said finally, my voice low. They didn't want responsibility, he said. But I pushed. I thought if I gave you to them it would be easier, cleaner. They agreed, out of obligation, not out of love. And I stayed quiet because I thought maybe it would change. But it didn't, I said. No, he said. It didn't. The candle flickered between us, the last of its wax slipping down the stem. The photo trembled in my hand. I should have been angry. Maybe I was. But it was buried beneath something else, grief. For a woman I never knew. For the years I spent trying to earn something that was never mine to begin with. For the version of me that didn't know any better. I looked at Walter again. He hadn't moved, just waited. I placed the photo down gently beside my plate and stood up. The lights were on at the Royce house. Candles glowed in the window, and wreaths framed the door like something out of a catalogue. Walter and I stood on the porch, the cold biting through my coat. I hadn't been here in over a year, maybe longer. The sidewalk still had that crack I used to trip over as a kid. Walter gave me a nod. I knocked. It took a moment, but eventually the door swung open. Meredith stood there in a red sweater, her lips pressed into a line, eyes scanning me with surprise that quickly hardened into irritation. "Callan," she said flat. "It's late. I need to speak to all of you," I said. "Now." She hesitated, then stepped back without a word. We entered. The warmth inside felt artificial, like walking into a staged set. The scent of pine and cinnamon hit me, but it didn't soften anything. Dale was in his recliner, legs crossed, flipping through a football recap on his tablet. Nolan lounged on the couch with a drink in hand, phone glowing in his other. No one looked up until Meredith cleared her throat. Dale's eyes landed on me. "Didn't expect to see you tonight," he said, as if this were a casual drop-in. I stood in the middle of the room, Walter a few steps behind me. "I know the truth," I said. "About Mara, about the envelope, about how none of this, none of you, was ever really mine." The silence cracked. Dale blinked, then sat up straighter. "That was decades ago," he said quickly. You were just a baby. We raised you. That's what matters. You took me because it was convenient, I said. Because Walter couldn't and you felt pressured. And then you made me spend 30 years begging for scraps of belonging. Nolan snorted from the couch. What, you want a refund? My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. No, I want acknowledgement, not money, not apologies you don't mean, just the truth. You never chose me, and I see that now. Dale opened his mouth, but Walter's voice came first. You never saw the boy for who he was, he said, stepping forward. You saw what he wasn't. You held him at a distance because he didn't come from you. That's on you, not him. Meredith looked away. Nolan rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. Dale just sat back like he'd been dismissed from a conversation he didn't care to finish. I took one last look around the room, the garland-wrapped banister, the framed photos of Nolan, through every stage of life, the bare walls where my childhood never really existed. I felt no need to raise my voice. I had what I needed. I turned to Walter. He nodded. We stepped outside without another word. The air was colder than before, but it didn't sting. It felt honest. I followed Walter down the steps, the sound of the door closing behind us, as quiet as an ending. We got back to my apartment just after 10. The warmth inside felt different now, less like shelter, more like recovery. I hung up our coats while Walter sat at the table eyeing the envelope still resting near the candle's hardened wax. I've held on to one more thing, he said quietly, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. It's hers. He placed a small leather-bound journal in front of me. The corners were worn, the elastic band stretched loose. I picked it up slowly, the weight of it heavier than it looked. My name was written on the first page in the same careful script as the letter. I turned to a marked page. Walter had folded the top corner. If something happens to me, Dad, don't let guilt raise him. Don't let fear decide where he goes. Just love him. He's not a burden. He's my beginning, not my end. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I finished reading. I pressed the journal closed, my hands trembling slightly as I set it down. She wanted you, Walter said. Not just in a biological sense. She hoped God, she hoped you'd feel that one day. I nodded slowly. It wasn't enough to fill the void, but it softened the sharpest edge. He leaned back in his chair. I've got space out at the house. It's not much. 1 floor, some land out back, chicken's garden, peace. If you want it, it's yours. I didn't answer right away. I didn't have to. Something in the quiet between us had already filled in the gaps. It's not much, he added, but it's honest. I looked around my apartment, the table still set for a family that never came, the cooled food, the flickering lights on the window. And then I looked at Walter. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like someone's responsibility. I felt like someone's choice. I walked to the closet, pulled down the overnight bag I used in college, and started packing. Weeks passed in quiet, honest rhythm. Mornings started with coffee on Walter's porch and ended with long walks behind the tree line where the frost hung low. I didn't miss the city, and I didn't miss the noise that used to live in my head. But there was one thing left to do. I wrote the letter slowly, without bitterness. Dear Dale and Meredith, thank you for the years of shelter. Thank you for food, for structure, for the version of parenting you could offer. But I now know who I am, and I'm not yours to ignore, to tolerate, or to frame around Nolan's shadow. I no longer need your validation or your silence. You don't have to reply. I'm not waiting anymore. Callan. I mailed it the next morning and didn't check the box again for days. Nothing came back. The silence wasn't loud. It was expected. A week later, my phone buzzed. Nolan's name lit the screen. I didn't answer. A text followed. They're struggling. Eric blew most of their savings. Dad's health isn't great. Can you help? I stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. Then I locked the phone and set it face down. Walter was on the porch pruning the dead vines from the trellis. I joined him, handing him the small shears. He didn't ask. He'd already seen the look in my eyes. "They've got each other," I said. He nodded. "And you've got your life now." I sat beside him as he trimmed away what couldn't grow anymore. He handed me a sprig of dried lavender and said quietly, "Sometimes the best answer is silence." That night I lit a single candle on the windowsill and watched it burn all the way down. The tree was barely 5 feet tall, its branches uneven and thin in places, but Walter and I treated it like a cathedral. We strung white lights through its limbs and hung simple ornaments, wooden stars, copper bells, a few hand-carved pieces Walter had whittled himself over the years. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, and a soft jazz tune drifted from the old radio on the windowsill. The kind of music that didn't try to impress you, just sat beside you like an old friend. I reached into the box of decorations and pulled out the small worn photograph. Mara young and smiling with those eyes I knew too well. I set the frame gently at the base of the tree, angled toward the light. Walter watched from his chair, then rose slowly and crossed the room. He held a box no larger than his palm, wrapped in plain brown paper tied with twine. "I meant to give this last year," he said, "but I wasn't sure if it was the right moment." I untied the string and lifted the lid. Inside was a silver pocket watch. Its face was simple, classic. I turned it over, and there, etched into the back in small, deliberate letters, were the words, "You were always mine, even when the world didn't see it." My chest tightened, not from sadness this time, but from the strange warmth of being claimed not out of obligation, but from something truer. I closed the box carefully and placed it beside the photo of Mara, letting both rest beneath the soft glow of the tree. I stood by the window as snow began to fall, quiet and steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone to come. I was already home,